Dyken. I am in the RASA branch of the Safety Policy Division here at CPUC. And welcome to the Public Safety Power Shutoff Technical Working Group. Just a little bit about me. As I said, I'll be moderating today's meeting. I've been working on PSPS-related issues since initially joining the CPUC back in January of 2020, just before all of us started working from home. Just so that everybody is aware, I do have a bit of a speech disability, and I will stutter over my words at times. If that happens, just give me a second to get past that block, and we'll get past this. Great. On the line here, I have a few other colleagues from the City Policy Division, including my manager, Ben Turner. Do you want to say hi, Ben? All right. Hi, Ben. All right. Ben might not hear me. All right. We expect to have several participants joining us on our call today. So the technical working group was noticed not only to the SMAP service list, but also the service list for both the PSPS and the microgrids proceedings. That's because discussions at today's TWG may have or will have, implications for that work as well. There may be a possibility of additional PSPS-focused technical work group meetings, but that's going to depend a lot on the outcomes of this meeting and of any additional research on the topic that's conducted by both SBD and others. And then also, just so everyone is aware, this technical working group is being recorded. So on to introductions. Let's start with people at the CPUC Safety Policy Division.
I'm Ben Turner. I'm the program manager of the Safety Management Systems branch.
Thanks, Ben.
I'm Sheila.
Go ahead.
Sorry about that. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sheila Funk, and I'm an analyst in the Safety Policy Division.
Good morning, all. I'm Dan Bout. I'm the director of Safety Policy Division.
Thanks, Dan.
Hi, good morning. My name is Harjeet Singh. I'm brand new utilities engineer with the Safety Policy Division. Sorry.
Great, thank you.
Good morning, I'm Angelique Juarez. I'm an analyst in the Safety Policy Division.
All right, thanks, Angelique.
Hi, good morning. This is Eric. I am the senior engineer of Safety Policy Division.
All right, thank you, Eric.
Good morning. This is Arnold Sutton, analyst with the Safety Policy Division.
All right, Arnold, thank you.
Hi, good morning. This is Hafizer with SPD. I'm the senior utilities engineer.
All right, Hafizer, thank you. All right, who do you have on the line from PG&E?
Oh, one more.
One more.
Steve Hain from Senior Utilities Engineer from the Safety Policy Division, Risk Assessment and Analytics section.
All right, great. Thank you, Steve.
Let's go for PG&E. It's good morning. It's Vincent here.
Hi, Vincent.
You also have Ken Arnold.
Ken, thank you. SCE.
Good morning. Hello to everyone. This is Chris Vias with SCE.
I will be speaking on behalf of SCE. I'm joined today by Dan Kamla of SCE Regulatory Affairs. We may have others from SCE speaking on an as-needed basis as the Q&A and discussion occurs. So I just want to note there may be other members of the team that might speak as needed, and we do have others that are certainly listening in on this important topic.
Great, thank you. SDG&E?
Good morning, this is Josh Stewart, and speaking on behalf of SDG&E, Mason Withers will also be attending.
Okay, great, thank you. Any other utilities on the line? All right, there are none. Let's go to the interveners. We have somebody from a Mussey Grade Road Alliance.
Yes, this is Joseph Mitchell from Mussey Grade Road Alliance.
Hi, Joseph. Turn.
Hi, this is Katie Morsoni from Turn. I also have Charles Feinstein, our consultant on the line, and David Chang, another staff attorney at Turn on the line as well.
Great, thank you, Katie. Let's see here, who else? Protect Our Communities.
This is Julia Severson. I'm here listening in on behalf of Melinda Dickinson.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Any other any other intervener parties?
Hi, good morning. This is Andrew Graff on behalf of Coalition of California Utility Employees.
Thank you, Andrew.
And Paul Chernick on behalf of SBUA.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. This is Chris Parks on behalf of Cal Advocates, and also Miles Gordon and Tess Madera are here, as well as Ian Fisher. There may be others from the Cal Advocates tuning in today as well. Thank you.
Hi, Eric Warchek with UCAN, supporting UCAN. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. All right. Anybody here that is representing or listening in for who's with the PSPS proceeding? All right, hearing none. Anybody on here representing the microgrids proceeding?
Yeah, hi, this is Julian Ennis. I'm a utilities engineer with the Resiliency and Microgrids team.
Okay, thank you. All right, and anybody else who I might have missed?
This is Roseanne Rutkevich. I'm with an analyst on the Resiliency and Microgrids team with the Resilient Microgrids proceeding.
Okay, thank you.
This is Joyce Steingass. I'm a senior utilities engineer with the Resiliency and Microgrids team and Energy Division. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
This is Max Henry here. I'm from Lumina Decision Systems, and I'm working with Level 4 Consulting project focusing on RSC and PSPS.
All right, thank you. Okay. Okay, so I'm going on to the background here. So during the May 6th Phase 1 Track 1 Technical Working Group, parties and other participants in that meeting raised concerns that not enough is known or widely understood about the risk associated with PSPS events in order to adequately assess them in a risk-based decision-making framework, or RDF. All participants agreed to the need for one or more PSPS focused technical working groups starting in July of 2021, and this meeting is a result of that request. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the meeting today, and one of the things that I meant to put on a slide and I forgot to, was language that was in Phase 1 track 1 of the decision. So I'm going to put that in the chat right now. There we go. In the clarifying RDF technical requirements in phase 1, track 1, it asks the question, should the commission clarify aspects of the RDF adopted in D18-12-014? And specifically, question B was, how should public safety power shut-off events and other utility activities with high customer impacts be treated in the RDF? So kind of think of that as kind of the, our guiding, purpose, or, here in this meeting. So my intention here is for this meeting to kind of be a free expression and sharing of, ideas, current practices, plans, concerns, knowledge barriers, things like that. It's the purpose of this meeting really isn't to yet debate or criticize these ideas. That time will come, but for right now, just kind of think of this almost as like a brainstorming exercise disguised as a technical working group. According to www.wework.com, a brainstorming exercise can be helpful to avoid the all too common scenario when an idea is shot down before it is time to grow, transform, and develop. By allowing everybody to capture their ideas before the critique begins, rapid ideation, that's not a word that you hear all the time, avoids the inevitable premature shooting down of ideas. So whether an idea is good or bad, just kind of want everything out here on the table right now. During our presentations today, here's some things to consider. What issues or questions need to be addressed? What do we know and what don't we know? Where do we have a disagreement, agreement, and where is compromise possible? And what are some ideas for next steps? We will listen to 3 different presentations today. The first will be a prepared presentation. It is a joint one from the 3 large electric IOUs, SCG&E, SCE, and SDG&E. The second will be a presentation from the Muskie Grade Road Alliance, and the third will be a presentation from Cal Advocates. Each presentation will be given 25 minutes, then an additional 5 minutes for participants to ask any clarifying questions. If this isn't enough time, don't worry. There will be 30 minutes of general discussion time scheduled after all 3 presentations. Not all of the parties here were able to prepare a presentation, but asked to be able to share their thoughts verbally. This can be done during that general discussion time. Before we start, are there any questions about the meeting format or purpose? Okay, hearing none. Can we queue up the presentation from the joint IOUs? All right, joint IOUs, I think that we're ready for you.
Hello.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, it's Vincent. I'll be leading off for the joint IOUs. First off, again, I want to apologies in advance again because I have some people working on the house. So once in a while, you might hear some heavy work boots tromping across the floor. Hope that's okay. So if you move on to the next slide, please. So once again, David, thanks for bringing up for setting the context of the meeting. We also wanted to know that you know, based on the ALJ's ruling providing staff recommendation for comment, we see this TWG as a meeting to further scope the issues related to modeling PSPS events in the RDF. And any substantial changes to the adopted RDF approaches to be addressed in phase 2 of the RDF proceeding. So thanks for mentioning this is definitely a brainstorming activity. And we wanted to kind of focus our initial brainstorming on, you know, how this set of activities lays out over the phase 2 timeline, right? So our presentation is going to be focused not on technical details, but basically scope and schedule. So the presentation, it's not a very long one. We just wanted to keep it high level, consists of some initial considerations that we thought about, and then comes up with a proposed scope, and following that, a proposed schedule. Let's move on to the next slide. As far as initial considerations, I think everybody online knows that there are many activities happening around PSPS. And it's, you know, as we think about it, you know, when I first looked at this topic, it was there's a lot of stuff going on, and you know, how do we draw a path through all the different proceedings, different activities that are out there. So one of the things we needed to kind of understand was all the different aspects that these different proceedings address. One of the things that we think about is that as far as PSPS operational guidelines, reporting procedures, and compliance / reasonableness, those are addressed in the PSPS OIR, which is R.20-07-013, and the utility wildfire mitigation plans. So we necessarily feel that we need to focus on the risk aspects here, and not those topics that I talked about, meaning the operational guidelines reporting. Not because we don't want to focus on them, but because, you know, there's a lot of activity on those topics in those other proceedings. Another thing that I think is really important to emphasize, we did talk about, we here, you know, ostensibly talk about PSPS consequences, but when you look at the ALJ's original statement and the scoping memo, it's not only PSPS, but other high impact risks, right? So PSPS cannot be analyzed in isolation. When we talk about PSPS consequences, exploring further consequences of PSPS that may not have been incorporated right now, we also need to look at other consequences from wildfire risk itself. Have we captured all the wildfire risk consequences? That needs to be something that we think about in this context as well. So two are very related topics. I think moving on to the third point, I think whenever we do exercises like this, it's very important to clearly make sure everyone clearly understands what are the use cases we're aiming for, right? So where will the PSPS work that we're doing here, the modeling activities we have here, I think understanding how those results, those work that we're doing, how they will be applied, that understanding upfront ahead of time, that kind of sharpens the focus that we can bring to this activity. So one of the things that we should consider are what are the primary and secondary use cases that will benefit from additional modeling of PSPS consequences. We feel it's important to reveal existing filings to understand where additional modeling might lead to significantly different conclusions. Where are the areas that need the most improvement in terms of PSPS modeling, and we focus on those. PSPS is a big topic, and we do have a limited amount of time. I mean, we phase 2 doesn't kick off yet, but everybody knows time flies. So it's very important. We ask ourselves, why are we doing this? And so that we can sharpen our focus. Another thing that's kind of related is I mentioned earlier that there are other proceedings out there that either impact the work that we're doing here or are impacted by our efforts here. Some that we can think of as the PSPS OII. There was some orderings from there. The WMP resolutions, the upcoming WMP resolutions, the microgrid proceedings. Those are some of the areas where I've been able to identify, and it might not be the full comprehensive list, but these are some of the areas that I've identified where there are touch points between what we're doing here and the activities in those proceedings. And they impact us in terms of we need to make sure that if there's overlap, we identify that and we resolve those overlaps. And also in terms of schedule, there are some those proceedings have their own timelines, and so we need to be mindful ahead of time how we interact with those proceedings. Another topic that I think is really important that perhaps in the past we haven't thought about, but I think it's really something that we need to think about is transition plan. The results that we get from our analysis here, the work that we're doing here, how do we bring that back into ongoing risk-based proceedings, right? How do we fold that into WMP? You know, if we get a decision here end of next year in December, you know, I think would be perhaps a bit difficult to fold that into the upcoming WMP in February, right? So we need to think about what the transition looks like, and it all depends on how the analysis goes forward. You know, if it's something that we can implement soon, of course we want to do that. But some things do take a longer time to implement. So let's set up a reasonable transition plan ahead of time so everyone understands, you know, when to expect the fruits of our labor. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to mention on this slide is improved modeling should be data-driven. The models require objective and documentable sources of consequences. You know, we hear a lot about PSPS, and one of the struggles that we have is, you know, in terms of quantifying the consequences is we need objective and documentable sources. It's our hope that, you know, part of the session we can find those sources, perhaps develop those sources. And the other thing that we need to be aware of is that the adopter framework that is the outcome of this this phase 2 work should retain the flexibility to incorporate these new data sources in a particular manner that best fits the overall SMAP implementation and fosters transparent and effective risk-informed decision making. So how I see it is basically, I don't think it's the intention of this working group, this set of activities to say, for example, PG&E should adopt the WINGS model from Sempra. WINGS model is great. I think we're very impressed by it, but you know, each of us IUs are a little different. We have to model things a little differently because of the different nature of our service territories. So we see this effort as informing the data, informing some of the ways that we can take that data into account in our own modeling, and not necessarily impose, you know, modeling solutions on us. So that's it for this slide. I'm going to hand it off to Edison to talk about the next slide.
Hello, good morning. Again, Chris Vias with Edison. And sorry, my screen is a little blank here. Okay. So just going to spend a few minutes now talking about scope. and the perspective of the utilities on what the appropriate scope should be. And I also want to say before I start is we also look forward to the other parties' presentations and hearing what they have to say on these various subjects. The utilities believe that phase 2 of this risk OIR needs to focus on PSPS risk from a system-wide perspective, and it should not stray into the operational aspects of PSPS events and responses. We're not saying in any way that those operational aspects are not important. They are, of course, very important. They're important to the utility, they're important to our customers, they're important to our regulator, they're important to all of the stakeholders. But the operational aspects of PSPS, which includes the guidelines and the requirements that govern PSPS, those are more appropriately addressed within the scope of the PSPS OIR itself. And for parties listening on the phone, that PSPS OIR is rulemaking number 18-12-005 before the Commission. And as part of this process, we would definitely appreciate feedback from the stakeholders on quantitative and documented evidence of PSPS safety, financial, and reliability impacts beyond those that we already incorporate into our risk analyses. Again, I think a key point to sum up here is that when we look at scope, we don't want to have the inconsistent results with the PSPS OIR or with other Commission proceedings. And the best way to do that is to have the scope here stick to PSPS risk analysis issues and not the critical PSPS operational issues. So to get into a little bit more specifics with some examples, what the joint utilities see as in scope is customer and community impacts from PSPS events that relate to safety, financial, and reliability consequences, i.e. relate to these aspects of risk modeling. And then risk modeling of PSPS to help ensure the appropriate data, assumptions, and methods are used in that modeling. Again, what we see as out of scope is the operational aspects of PSPS, and this would specifically include what are the thresholds for when to or when not to de-energize customers? What is the timing and content of notifications to customers? And what is the reasonableness review that should occur for the actual PSPS events? In addition, what is out of scope is the in-event operational tools and exploration of those. So that concludes my presentation on this slide. I'm going to turn it back over to PG&E.
Thanks, Chris. So this brings us to this slide. We covered scope here, and when we talk about scope, next thing we talk about schedule. So this is basically timeline that the IOUs we brainstormed and thought that this scope addresses, works with the phase 2 timelines as well as with all the other IOU related proceedings that are out there. So this is a scope that we believe starts with establishing use cases for modeling efforts. So sorry about that. The first thing I wanted to mention, establish use cases for modeling effort. This is going back to the point that I talked about earlier, which is basically understanding the primary and secondary use cases. So here, we would like to clearly articulate how the modeling effort will be employed and why it is necessary, right? So some example use cases for this PSPS modeling is calculating RSEs and RAMP and GRC. But let's put the full list out there of how the modeling is lacking right now and how and where are the areas we need to improve once again so that we can get that focus. And then the next item we see in the scope is basically review of wildfire PSPS modeling in San Diego ramp. This is kind of reflecting on some of the writings that we've seen from SPD. I think we've seen the recommendation that SPD is really looking forward to San Diego's ramp to look at the PSPS modeling. So we felt that we need to accommodate this in the schedule. So that's activity that we think should be happening in the Q4 timeframe. And then moving on, the next thing that we need to consider is basically review of 2021 reports from R.20-07-013. That's the PSPS OII. And that PSPS OII has some requirements in it, namely that utilities should start quantifying the impacts to customers from the PSPS events that have happened, right, in the 10-day reporting. So we feel that that's a very related topic, and that's something that basically something we need to look at first, because it's going to give us a lot of insight and data on consequences. So that's something that is that requirement, is effective as of now, but we feel that we need to get some of those reporting under our belt first, get some samples to understand, if there's any data, new consequences we need to consider, so on and so forth. And we see that happening in Q1 2022 because we feel that it's appropriate to wait for the end of the fire season to get that set of reports in and then start digesting those reports. And then finally, we kind of move on to the modeling phases here. And here we look at reliability, safety, and financial modeling. And here we go in depth into each of these attributes, right? We look at whether there are additional data sources, additional measures to capture the PSPS and wildfire consequences. So we do that separately in separate in streams for reliability, and then another stream for safety, and then one for financial. And we see that effort stretching out from Q1 2022 through Q2 2022. And then finally, the outcome of all that is basically, analyze the work we've done and talk about issuing reports and recommendations where we document and summarize the findings. And we see that activity happening in the third quarter of 2022, which should lead up to, I believe in the scoping memo, the timeline for phase 2 was basically, I think, expected decision in fourth quarter. I might be wrong, but I believe it was expected decision in fourth quarter of 2022. So I think this timeline that we forth here kind of meets up nicely with the phase 2 timelines as well. Okay, that's it for me.
All right, this is David here again. That's the end of the presentation?
Yeah, that concludes it for the joint IOUs.
Okay, so on our agenda, we have until 10:15. If anybody has any questions, regarding the presentation that we just heard.
This is Miles Gordon from Cal Advocates, and I have one. Could we go back to the scope slide, please? So I just had a clarifying question regarding, some of the points that you and NC were arguing are out of scope. For example, thresholds and timing and content, customer notifications. I mean, I think we definitely agree that we want to delineate the sort of PSPS from a system-wide perspective versus these operational components. However, I think we would want. I think my question is just: are you suggesting that this data should be excluded from calculating customer harms? Because I think specifically like timing and content, customer notifications. I mean, I think we can agree that timing of customer notifications affects customer harms. I mean, if a customer is notified on time, then they can make the necessary preparations and so on and so forth. And so I guess I'm just wondering, like, are you or are you not suggesting that this data should be excluded from calculating PSPS impacts and harms to customers?
Thank you, Miles. This is Chris Vias with Edison. I think I can field that question. We're not, in saying what's out of scope, we're not saying that such items might not be eventually part of risk modeling. But we're just saying that to try to decide so that, for example, what is the proper threshold for when or when not to de-energize customers? That, for example, is something that this isn't the right forum to explore. The specific timing of the notification of customers, that's out of scope here, but not saying that such information might not be germane to an eventual risk analysis, just saying that the decisions on those operational aspects, I don't want to exclude or, saying anything is include or exclude as a specific thing for the risk modeling, just saying for purposes of deciding what is the right place for that, what is the right threshold, for example, that is something that is an operational matter and should be addressed in the proper proceeding that is dedicated to those kinds of questions.
Hi,
Thank you, I
this is
appreciate
Eric
that.
Wojcik with UCAN, if I can ask a question. The outage cost analysis that's been done historically, and I raised before in our proceeding, the risk-based proceeding, is something that I don't see here and I don't see in our proceeding. It's not operational in that you're not going to make a decision based on that necessarily for PSPS, but you may. And that's something that hasn't been incorporated yet. I think that we should be discussing it in our proceeding because it's directly risk related and finance related. I mean, the outage costs of various customers means that you would prioritize certain circuits. And so would you consider the outage costs implications because they're so direct on customers, and that's what really matters, I think, to customers when you have a PSPS related event. And so it should be, at least in terms of analytics, part of our proceeding, I believe, and would strongly advocate for. Now, whether that's part of the PSPS operational aspect, that's not something that I think we're going to right now, which is actually what you're explaining in part, Chris. And yeah, we're not obviously jumping into the PSPS proceeding here to talk about what's there. What we're talking about is what's in our proceeding. Outage cost seems very important, and I'm saying that it should be here. I feel like I should have been ready for a presentation to give you a short presentation today, and I will be ready in the future. UCAN will be ready if we can have that discussion.
So let me take, I'm sorry, Chris, go ahead, Chris.
Real quick, Eric, thoughtful point, very much appreciate it, and others may jump in here. But I hear what you're saying, and it seems that what you're talking to is really sort of the financial impact, and that could be part of the financial consequence discussion. So I think that at least part of what you're saying, that could be part of the financial consequence, and I invite others to jump in here too as well.
Yeah, that's right. We didn't exclude just because it's not in our slides, we didn't exclude that, but rather we're saying here we're just trying to establish those timelines, those scope, and that some of that what you talked about, something certainly we can explore in one work streams that we've set up, either reliability or financial.
So Eric, this is Russell Archer from Edison. I just wanted to reiterate that what you described, right, the impact, the cost of outages is directly relevant to the analysis of the consequences of PSPS events. So I think it would absolutely be in scope. It's one of the key considerations about what are the consequences of PSPS.
Thank you, Russell. Yep. Thank you, Vincent, as well. Yep.
So Eric, you got 3 people from the utilities all saying yes to you. That is
okay. I'll be quiet. I got what we were hoping for. Thank you.
And Eric, thank you. That was, as I said at the beginning, that was a very thoughtful point and a really good comment. Very helpful clarification.
Thanks.
This is Chris Parks from Cal Advocates. I had a question for Vincent. On the next slide, I think it was the schedule. if we could. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so there's a lot to cover in this schedule, and it sounds like this is going to cover all kinds of different aspects of PSPS. I just wanted to understand, however, that this schedule is not going to preclude the utilities from conducting risk analysis now to try to mitigate PSPS now. Although right now, I imagine that this is going to evolve into more of a structured format that's going to come out of this rulemaking. But this schedule doesn't preclude utilities from, conducting those analyses now, doing what they can to mitigate the harms of PSPS to customers now. Is that true?
Yeah, that's correct. That's why the transition plan is something that we want to discuss, right? Because the stuff that we're doing now, we'll continue to keep doing it now. But as we learn more through this proceeding, we're going to get new information, new improvements, and how do we bring that in, right? That's something that we want to discuss, so everybody ahead of time knows where we stand right now and understands the plan, how we get to the end goal.
Got it. Thank you.
So Vincent, this is Mason from SDG&E. To answer Chris's question, at SDG&E, we're actually already doing all of these things to some extent, and I think this effort is going to, for a lot of times you just put something out there to see if it works and see how well it's going, and then this effort here is going to fine tune that with all the outside input so that we're all on the same page. But yes, this is definitely not precluding us from doing work, and I have people working on this at this very moment, as a matter of fact. So thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
This is Chris Vias with Edison. On behalf of Edison, just to also say, we're always conducting risk analysis to try to mitigate the impacts of PSPS as appropriate and necessary. So no, we're not awaiting, we're not stopping work in that risk analysis, awaiting the outcome of anything from this proceeding. I think it's fair to say the utilities are all doing everything they can to conduct the right risk analysis to try to mitigate those impacts. We're very aware of the impacts it has on our customers and the communities we serve, and whatever we can do within our reasonable abilities to mitigate that, we are absolutely doing. Thank you for the question. It was a really important point to raise, and thank you for raising it. Really good, real life point. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Hi, this is Joe Mitchell from Mussey Grade Road Alliance, and I'd like a little bit more illumination on the question of thresholds and whether those are in scope or not, because thresholds affect not only the frequency of PSPS events and the extent and the consequences of PSPS events, they also impact wildfire frequencies and wildfire impacts as well. So you can see that they would be affecting the RDF, certainly. Then how do you then incorporate the changes in, say, a proposed mitigation? How does that feed back into the operational concerns regarding thresholds?
Dr. Mitchell, thank you for your question. Chris Vias with Edison, and you're asking a really good question at a more technical level. And so to try and give you the best answer, we're going to have one of our experts join here to be part of answering that question. So I'm going to ask that Brian Landry of SCE please speak to your question.
Hey, thanks, Chris. So Dr. Mitchell, to your point, at least at Edison, what we're trying to do now, and I know to some extent the other utilities, is recalibrate our FPI thresholds. They're very region specific. You're going to see that going forward. So we just got approval to refresh sort of our thresholds by fire climate zone because we know that the risk within those climate zones may be different depending on the wind and FPI. I think this also goes to the point about thinking about a risk tolerance level. So right now, we're still waiting on phase 2 of this decision to give us a risk tolerance level. And that risk tolerance level is going to be important because that helps us calibrate that FPI and not necessarily just, use the established ones that we have now. So hopefully that answers your question.
I think we will have more time to discuss it. I just wanted to make clear that I think thresholds are very important to RDF, and so I don't think we should just a priori say those aren't included. But I think Chris, I did understand that you're saying, no, they're included. We're just not going to, in the RDF, use the RDF to say this is the correct threshold and then enforce
That's
that
right.
operationally.
That's right.
Right. Well said, Dr. Mitchell. That's it.
Now, I think what would be interesting in phase 2 is if we have some risk tolerance threshold established, then we can come back and revise what those thresholds could be. But again, we're still waiting on what that threshold could be from the commission.
Thanks.
David, this is Joyce Steingess from the Energy Division. And I know from this discussion, I'm also interested in knowing, is the goal to avoid all ignitions caused by certain kinds of failures? And to what extent would this proceeding get into the discussions related to tree-caused failures, such as, and what would the role of the commission be in setting the risk tolerance for things such as tree fall-in risk and the issues that PG&E has been discussing in tree overstrike?
I think the work that we're doing here is going with the ALJ's question originally is going to be focused on the consequences of PSPS. So that's the direct focus. There might be an indirect tie-in, like you mentioned, but that's out for us. I think the focus once again is PSPS, consequences of PSPS.
Hi, this is Hafizur Chaudhary with SPD. I have a question along the same line, what everybody pretty much discussing. If you look at historically, which I'm sure you all did better than I did, in 2020 fire-related wildfire has been increased exponentially in terms of climate change and worsening the situation even bad than 2019, 2018. And I'm sure you are looking into all the different modelings. And I think Vincent mentioned about wings. My question is, I know you are going to do more modeling and data analysis in Q2, but in the interim time right now, as we are facing and going through the wildfire, and it will reach PSPS, what we're discussing here, is there any additional blanket you folks have looking into so that more wildfire as is happening, we can still prevent the assets of the IOU employees along with the customers?
So this is Russell. I could maybe take a stab at that.
Sure.
Russell Archer from Edison. So wildfire mitigation generally is the utilities, at least Southern California, Edison's literally highest priority. It is our #1 safety risk. It is the #1 safety consequence to customers. And so PSPS is a tool that we use to avoid ignitions that could lead to catastrophic wildfires. It's a measure of last resort pursuant to the commission's directions, but it's an important tool. And I think that the purpose of this subgroup, or whatever we're calling it, is to discuss the trade-offs of using that tool, right? There are benefits of using that tool, the avoidance of wildfires, but there are costs to using it, costs to customers, impacts to customers. As far as our ongoing attempts to mitigate wildfire risk more generally, that's a much broader discussion, right? That's something that we do through the WMT process. That's something that we do through our respective general rate cases and proposing the infrastructure investments that are necessary to mitigate fires. It's a very important question, but I think it's broader than the scope of what we're talking about here today.
Thanks.
All right, thanks everyone. This is David here. We're at our stop point for the discussion on the joint IUs presentation.
David, I've had my hand up for about 10 minutes and no one's actually doing it. Do we just jump in?
Oh, sure. Okay, is this a question that needs to be asked now, or can we wait until after?
No, I think this is direct to this point. I'm sorry to do this, but I have been waiting. This is Arthur Fisher from Cal Advocates. I have two questions. One is specific to PG&E, and the second one is more generally to the utilities. The first one to PG&E, I'm trying to understand the relationship between your regionalization process, which is punting to this this proceeding for operational measures. So so are you envisaging these being used as operational measures? That's question specific to PG&E. And my second question is to all utilities. Are you measuring the morbidity, mortality, and accident consequence of PSPS incidents?
Sorry, this is Vincent from PG&E. So once again, so our understanding that this proceeding is going to focus on risk aspects, right? So not operational aspects of PSPS. That's in R.20-07-013. That's where we look at the procedures and feel that that's probably the area we want to look at, how we overlay our regionalization efforts over there. And this one, we strictly want to focus on, in this particular track of this risk-based decision-making OIR, we want to focus on consequences of PSPS and other high-impact risk events.
So are you tracking deaths, sickness, and accidents as a consequence of a PSPS event?
That's something that, that's something that we want to discuss, whether we're adequately tracking those events.
So you're not doing it at the moment?
What's that?
You're not doing it at the moment?
We're tracking all the consequences that we can quantify.
So you can't quantify those?
That's something that we need to discuss.
Okay, thank you.
Definitely something that we need to discuss.
So there's no data for 2020 or 2019 with regard to that, since we're talking about modeling. If you're not actually collecting the data, we can't actually model it, can we?
So that's something that we have to think about the different ways that, and I think Chris brought up some, maybe it was Chris, maybe it was Eric that brought up some other measures we can look at, reliability measures, outage measures, financial measures to track those kind of consequences.
Okay, thank you. And then my second one is about regionalization, which is specific to PG&E. Your regionalization proceeding is pushing to this proceeding to provide operational measures. You do know that, don't you?
I'm actually not that aware of that. I'm under the impression that this, like I mentioned earlier, that this is a proceeding that talks about risk modeling of PSPS events. And so I'm not aware of that myself.
Okay, fair enough.
I think that's probably, in my opinion, I think that's probably, I'm sorry, go ahead.
This has been I think what Arthur's referring to is the safety and operational metrics in phase 1, track 2 of this proceeding.
Yeah, so that is, yep, that's a different track of the proceeding. That's in track 1.
So I think we're at time for this. So if we have time at the end, we can continue on with Arthur's questions. But according to the schedule, we're on track to move on to the Mussey Grade Roads presentation.
Right. Okay. Thanks everyone for that conversation. Because it's 10:25, I'm going to tack 5 minutes onto Mussey Grade's time. So Mussey Grade, take it away.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt really quick. I just want to make note, as a reminder to everyone, that this technical working group meeting is to focus on scoping out SPS RDF related topics for future planning in R.20-07-013. And so a lot of the discussion has been great so far, but we want to keep in mind this is mainly for our planning purposes to see what topics are a priority for future technical working group meetings.
Okay, I'll try to make up some time. If we can go to the first slide, this isn't the first slide. Okay, so I was asked to prepare some comments on power shutoff. We've been involved in power shutoff ever since the first SDG&E application back in 2008. And we've had a long history with it. If you could go to the next slide, please. There has been a lot of discussion and talk at the commission regarding power shutoff, what its proper place is, what are the best ways to mitigate for it, what the harms are. Back in 2009, as a result of the SDG&E application, the commission determined that shutoff thresholds should be based on a cost-benefit analysis, or at least the utilities weighing the harm of power shutoff against the benefit. That being said, the tinder dry brush loophole was added so that if the utility felt there was an immediate risk of wildfire ignition due to severe weather conditions, they could de-energize. That was later expanded in 2012 to include vegetation, and the language regarding last resort was added. I'm sorry, the vegetation risks were added in ESRB 8, and then it was applied to all utilities, and since the 2017 and 2018 fires, it's become widespread throughout the state. So next slide, please. Back in 2009, this is a white paper that I wrote back then, sort of justifying the idea of a cost-benefit analysis, the idea that you have a certain set of costs that are created by shutting off the power. Those are largest when you have a low threshold, because that means you're shutting off the power more often and over wider areas. As you raise the threshold, you're shutting off the power less, but then your wildfire risks increase, and the wildfire risks tend to have a large and very damaging tail for extreme events. And so that tends to take off when you don't shut off the power at all, regardless of other considerations. The idea is that you can do an optimization with regard to power shutoff and try to identify what the best, from a societal risk point, when you're talking about costs, it's not necessarily just money costs, it can be cost to society, lives, and harm. So next slide, please. As we've gone through these proceedings, various interveners, including MGRA, have come up with a fairly extensive laundry list of potential harms. These can basically be put into two bins. One is just dependent on the scope of the PSPS event. So things like safety, traffic accidents, that type of thing. Health risks, people who are at risk as far as health conditions requiring power, health risk regard to communications, people not able to call 911, and then of course all of the standard economic risks, people's stuff spoils in their freezers and so forth. Then there are risks that are more weather dependent, and a lot of these are safety risks. So the potential for induced fires, such as from people cooking outside, running generators that aren't in particularly good shape that start fires, and then increases to fire vulnerability for people who are in high wildfire areas or high wildfire risk areas. Regardless of whether there's a power line fire, there is a high potential for other fires during these extreme weather conditions. And so these people need communications, being able to report fires, smoke, and evacuation. Next slide, please. And of course, balancing this is there are big dangers on both sides. So now that we've gone several years into this and we're getting a lot more experience with power shutoff, we're starting to get some examples of these theoretical risks that we talked about for years, things like generator fires, the thief fire, was a generator fire. The tick fire in near LA was supposedly a cooking fire. There are some claims being made against PG&E regarding auto accidents and so forth. On the other side of this, there's the risk of not shutting off in the right place at the right time. So even during, PSPS episodes, there are cases of fires that were not caught within the time and space limitations of the PSPS. And we have had a few of those over the last few years, some of which have been fatality fires and highly damaging, including the Camp Fire. Next slide, please. So all of these things are interconnected in very complex ways. And I've pulled some slides from my previous presentation on power laws and wildfires. And these are, this diagram is meant to show some of the interconnections. So that basically at one end, you've got a weather event driving your problem. The weather event is driving the wildfire risk. And that at the bottom is going to just drive general ignitions. Any ignition that you have is much more likely to develop into a major fire, regardless of whether it comes from power lines under these conditions. So your overall wildfire risk increases during these weather events, with or without power lines being involved. You then have high winds that can help to facilitate utility ignitions. And those then contribute to wildfire risk. Now, PSPS helps to mitigate utility ignitions because you've turned off the power to the extent that it's effective. And so you see two colors in the PSPS box. There's a piece that's where PSPS is working, and then there's the piece where you're just not efficient. So you've got all of these risks being driven. Now, the PSPS is also being driven by the weather event. Your PSPS is going to be of greater extent, greater duration, affecting more people if it's during a more severe weather event. So the way the utilities craft their PSPS boundaries and durations is to match it to the weather event. So, and therefore your risks are going to scale with the weather event. So you've got, when you get to the right side, your event risks, you've got wildfire risks and you've got PSPS risks, both contributing to the event risk. And so that's what the RDF in the end is going to try to take into account, should try to take into account, is all of these interconnections. So next slide, please. So one of the ideas I put forward, this is just an idea that we've explored in the PG&E ramp, and we'll be discussing it more in RDF and possibly in the SDG&E ramp as well, is the idea that possibly risk tranches could be related to fire weather severities, so that you have sort of a base fire weather severity where it's basically safe operations. You trust your infrastructure to be safe at some level. There's always going to be some level of random ignitions. There's a constant level of ignitions that are reported by the utilities for various reasons, squirrels, car accidents, various other things, causing ignitions at a baseline throughout time. As you get to higher weather severities, what you'd like to be able to do is for extreme severities, mitigate through PSPS, but for mid-range tranches, work really hard to mitigate those so that you can raise the PSPS threshold and make that particular tranche safe for operation within certain wildfire severities. And I think some of the utilities are actually working in this direction, not formally using this method now, but they're applying mitigations, trying to eliminate PSPS in certain areas, raise thresholds, and so forth. So how to best quantify this, it will be one of the things we discuss in the RDF. Next slide, please. So this is a slide from the last time. So you don't have to read through it. If you could just go to the next slide. I circle something, yes. So what we want to be handling in this particular proceeding is quantifying the PSPS consequences and how efficient PSPS is, and some of the and discuss mitigations for PSPS that could affect that quantification. I call that hard, and you'll see why it's hard. There's a lot of stuff that we have to look at. Next slide, please. One of the ways that people have been looking at this problem using, people, as Eric has mentioned before, there's been a lot of studies on the effects, societal effects, economic costs of power outages. There's a standard methodology originated by people working at LBL, and also we have some people at the at Nexent Incorporated who are experts in doing this type of calculation. One thing that the authors warn about is that these are usually for non-anticipated power outages, number one, and also mostly for less than 24-hour outages. So while this is nice methodology and people can plug and play with the models that they've built, it's not necessarily appropriate to our current situation. One question that I would like to bring up is, should we be reaching out to these experts who have been deep in studying this problem for a long time? I understand from a comment that somebody made in a meeting a few days ago that some of the utilities are actually reaching out to them on their own now, which is appropriate, but I think it would be even more appropriate for the commission to bring in consultants of this type for the RDF proceeding, because there's a lot of stuff that has already been done that could be reused for this. And also the subtle differences as far as what we've learned and the difference in people getting prior notice and the people becoming accustomed to it and taking personal mitigations themselves. These are going to really affect some of these calculations. So I don't think just an out-of-the-box calculation necessarily based on other outages elsewhere is necessarily going to be the most appropriate. Finally, a lot of these calculations are based on survey instruments. We certainly have a lot of people who've been subject to power shutoff in California now. It seems to me that this is a very ripe area for further research by people who are interested in this particular topic. So next slide, please. Just to sort of run through what we know and what we don't know and what we would want to learn with regard to some of the risks that we've raised over the years. We have some data, certain data is available, and we would need to quantify that. There are different classes, communications, transportations, for instance, loss of the ability to call 911. This can lead to bad health and safety outcomes. Also, it can also lead to initial attack delays. So I've added that little slide there, or that little image there of the black swan to indicate where there are risks that have possibly high tail end consequences. When trying to do an optimization between one type of extreme value event like wildfire, which has very shallow power line or power law dependencies exponents, where you can have a very impactful tail and very impactful extreme events, especially where there's a lot of uncertainty. Usually, if you're balancing that against known costs, it's better to just mitigate the extreme event, because it's just almost always going to be in favor of doing the mitigation against the extreme event. However, if you have on the other side extreme events as well, then you have to do that optimization balancing to make sure that you're not introducing major problems, major losses by mitigating the other risk that you're trying to mitigate for power shutoff, the wildfire risk. Notification, there's a safety risk from delayed evacuation. We don't know what that is right now. That would have to be an area of active research. Now, one thing we should also discuss as we're going through all of these potential impacts are potential mitigations that address them. So for instance, with delays in fire reporting, we have satellite fire detection programs, wildfire detection cameras coming online now. I think these need more quantification as far as their effectiveness, but those potentially could compensate for people not being able to call 911 because their power is out. For communications in general, communications facilities are supposed to start rolling out more backup power, so that will also mitigate some of these problems. Transportation, you have traffic signals, safety risks from delayed evacuations. Those also can be mitigated with microgrids and that sort of thing. So, and that's something we do have some data on, as far as we can look at the data during PSPS events. Is there an increase in accidents and so forth? Next slide, please. Ignitions, outdoor cooking fires, generator fires. There are ignition databases that can be explored for this. One thing that we used to bring up was candle fires too. I think people are more using LED lanterns now than candles. So I think that tends to mitigate that, but should be also investigated. Next slide, please. Water supplies. Firefighting, there have been some complaints that, okay, we need water and we can't fight the fire because we've lost our power. Also, people who are using wells for their animals and so forth, they don't have power. Mitigation in this case, potentially a generator program. And then vulnerable populations, I don't say much about it here because other groups such as C4AT and pretty much a lot of other government groups are really collecting a lot of data on this, and there's a lot of work going on in vulnerable populations. So I think this is an area where we have a lot more data than for other potential risks. Now, for all these potential risks, there should be some level of triage that goes on. It may be that after a cursory review, we realize that some of them are de minimis and we don't have to worry about them anymore, or that after some level of mitigation, they become de minimis. And if we're planning on that level of mitigation, then we don't have to take that risk into account either. So next slide, please. So summary, we should bring in, I don't say it here, but bring in an external consultant with expertise in how to do these surveys, how to get to find out what the economic losses are when they're adjusted for a PSPS flavor. We need to dig into ignition data, accident data, and so forth for PSPS caused effects. Somebody talked about epidemiological data, accident data, and so forth. we need to find out, what is smoke, delayed care, what are the effects on vulnerable populations. Another thing I'll insert here is that I know that the commission's directed the utilities to go off and do this, and they are at some level doing some of these studies themselves, but we don't have any guidelines or best practices wrapped around that. And I think this RDF is the venue for getting some of the best practices into place, so that the utilities are working from the same book, and so that interveners don't have a problem with it when the utilities finally come up with the result. So that's really the extent of my presentation. I have one extra slide here. Next slide, and that is. Just quickly, this week, the Techno Silver reports were sent out to the service list. I urge everybody to look at them. Very, very interesting. They're with regard to power shutoff. These are what-if analyses that ran utility damage reports and simulated the effect of wildfires. Just warning, can't take them as a statement of what the avoided losses are. I think they need some calibration. Specifically, some of the fires get cut off in mid-fire, so they are too small, whereas some other assumptions that are made, no firefighting, for instance, whereas most fires are knocked down by initial attack. And also it assumes that almost all of the damage events cause fires. So, which is not necessarily a valid assumption. I mean, we haven't had power line firestorms in Northern California prior to 2017. Where were those, where were all those power line firestorms in the past? Or is climate change just that dramatic? So I think this is all stuff that is really good, needs to be looked at, and is potentially informative for RDF as well in calculating what our avoided damages are from wildfires. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Mitchell. So we have until 10:55, just so that everyone has the same length of time for anybody to ask any additional questions or clarifications. And remember, if you're not able to get your question in that 5 minutes, we'll have half an hour at the end for more question and comment time.
Hi, this is Eric Wojcik with UCAN. Just to make a quick comment. Thank you very much, Joseph, for your presentation. I do want to say that on the outage cost kind of analysis and the need for another version of that, a different version of it, completely agree with that. But we need to figure out how to expand that because it's not just the economic impacts, as you said. And the question is, how do we expand that? So that starts to be a pretty tricky set of questions. And just one other point, and that's that the idea of balancing and optimization, those are two different things, as you know, and I think you know, and you've explained, thank you, how difficult it is to do this balancing where you would, with outage costs, just represent the outage cost versus the cost of the investment to reduce the outage costs and get an optimal there. This is a very, very different kind of equation. And I think, though, it deserves, in our risk-based proceeding, much more attention. Thank you.
Hi, this is Mason with SDG&E. It's always a pleasure to hear Joe talk. Joe and I have been in kind of the same circles for quite a while now. Dr. Mitchell, excuse me. And I really appreciate his work. A lot of the work that we are trying to do through WINGS is very similar to what Joe is presenting here. And I would suggest that, I think Joe's laid out a long list of things to be concerned with. And I think maybe that's a way we could go forward is let's make sure the list of things that are in the PSPS, what causes social and customer harm. And Joe has a lot of examples here, and I think there's probably even more than what Dr. Mitchell has. Let's lay out that list and let's all agree, like, these are the things that we don't want, these are the reasons we don't want to over PSPS or even PSPS to begin with. It's exactly the things that Joe was talking about. And then I think we can just kind of go through that list through this process here, this technical working group, and try to get the best answer. Like, how bad is this particular element? How bad is cooking, for example, as Joe pointed out? How bad is traffic light situations? Make that list, just kind of help quantify what that is, have everybody agree that the list is complete, and then use whatever method we can to go through, whether it's outside research or it's new research or it's internal utility proposals or third-party proposals or whatever, maybe Joe's proposals, and just say, like, this is how bad it is. And I think that's what this process is. So I appreciate Joe's presentation. I think everybody understands now we're focusing on that piece of the puzzle. How bad is PSPS to society and customers, and let's start quantifying it like crazy. So then later in other forums, we can use that to compare how bad wildfire is, and we'll have better tools. I just want to throw that out there. So thank you, Dr. Mitchell.
Thank you, Mason.
Dr. Mitchell, this is Dan Bout with SPD. In your research, did you come across any like analogous situations where there were proactive efforts that led to, other things that were measured, like hurricane evacuation, where they had that kind of data, where we could look to other situations where had similar balances?
I haven't, but I think it is appropriate to do that type of analysis. So, for instance, that the initial slide I showed back from 2009, that white paper. In that white paper, I also showed some hurricane data, and this was with regard to the wildfire risk, and it was demonstrating the fraction of the utility infrastructure that was damaged as a function of wind speed. And at a certain point, I think with PSPS, I think we can all, and I've said this before, I think we can all agree that we're only arguing about the thresholds. If we don't shut off power at all, and you have a 150 mile an hour winds, it's going to knock down utility lines and start terrible fires, and California gets destroyed. On the other hand, if you are so conservative that you shut off the power every time the wind blows 5 miles an hour, well, then you've just turned off California. Everybody can go home. So on both sides, if you do a sort of reductio ad absurdum, you come up with an unacceptable level of risk and loss. So somewhere in the middle, I think everybody agrees there is an appropriate question is, what is that appropriate use, and what mitigations can you do to reduce the PSPS without increasing the wildfire risk?
Great, thank you so much.
All right, thanks everyone. It's 10:55. Again, after our final presentation from Cal Advocates, we'll have time to ask additional questions and comments. But in the meantime, just so that everyone has time to talk, let's go on to the presentation for Cal Advocates. And again, just like we did for Dr. Mitchell, we're attacking 5 minutes onto the end here. So the presentation and questions for Cal Advocates, we have until 11:25. All right.
Thank you, David. This is Chris Parks with Cal Advocates. And so I guess I'm slated to go through 11:20. Is that right, David?
Yeah, that would be correct.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So if we can go to the first slide, it's not that many slides. appreciate, David, you highlighted in the chat box that one of the key objectives here is how should public safety shutoff events and other utility activities with high customer impacts be treated in the RDF? And now that I've learned that there's other folks from other proceedings attending this technical working group, I just wanted to, I thought it might make sense before I jump into the points on this display here, would just be to put this all in a little bit of context or a little bit of background for those who may not be familiar with it. So if we were to go back to in time to like 2010 and there was a San Bruno explosion of pipeline, after that, that initiated a whole bunch of things at the commission, which was to look at risk-based development of programs, in particular for the general rate cases. So a lot of the general rate cases have to do with, you know, applications coming in for programs that a utility has, and then there's a lot of discussion about what's in those applications, about the timing, the cost, the pace. I believe that my sense of it is that there was really concern that there was not enough emphasis on risk assessment and safety in those rate cases. So as a result of that, the commission initiated a rulemaking, and out of that rulemaking, the commission then created this safety model assessment proceeding, SMAP, we call it, in which the commission developed, with a lot of input from a lot of parties, a model for developing risk-based assessment and development of mitigation programs. And from that, then, there was this these RAMP proceedings, which were risk assessment mitigation phase proceedings that were individual to each utility, where a year before the utility brings in its general rate case application, there's a deep dive into risk assessment of utility programs with interveners and a lot of parties involved, and then they develop comments, and then the intent then is for that outcome from that proceeding to then shape the application that the utility brings forward with its mitigation programs in its general rate case application. Folks may correct me to the extent that I'm not completely accurate on that, but I just wanted to provide that kind of context. So PSPS is a significant risk for ratepayers and the public in general. And so that's why in this new version, so basically the RDF, or the risk-based defined framework proceeding, which is really the second version of the SMAP, where they're looking at refining the model that utilities will use to define their ramps. Now PSPS has come up as a significant risk that deserves special attention. And so that is why now this is being addressed in this rulemaking, to kind of define how PSPS can be assessed, and then how that can then drive the mitigation programs. And so it's of key importance, because out of this then will come the mitigation programs that can then mitigate the harms and risks that the public has as a result of PSPS events. And so I just wanted to provide that version of the context for this, for folks who may not be familiar with that. So that's the focus of what I believe is the focus of this technical working group, is to move that process forward and develop the best approach to figuring PSPS. So in that regard, I wanted to then just launch into this list of what Cal Advocates is suggesting for shaping the scoping of the RDF phase 2 of this proceeding. First off, so far in ramps, there's been some different ways that utilities have treated PSPS. PSPS is a mitigation of wildfire, but we're putting forward that it must be independently analyzed as a risk in its own accord, so that utilities will then develop mitigation programs to reduce those impacts. So, and then if we look at it, and we'll go into that in the next slide a little bit, but if we were to analyze PSPS as a risk on its own, rather than just as a mitigation of wildfire, it would actually rank likely as the second highest risk that a utility has to contend with. You know, even higher than, for example, a pipeline explosion or a number of other risks that utilities have to contend with. So we believe that PSPS needs to be explicitly analyzed as its own risk. Sure, it's okay to consider it as in terms of how it affects wildfire risk, but that should not limit it from being fully analyzed as a risk. And Dr. Mitchell mentioned a number of harms that PSPS occurs to the public. Arthur Fisher from Cal Advocates expressed the need for utilities to do a complete, thorough, robust analysis of the injuries, accidents, and other harms that PSPS, the real harms that PSPS has. And so we believe in the next phase of the RDF that those all need to be front and center in analyzing PSPS risk. So PSPS, one of the reasons for doing this is because if you then look at your risk, then as part of the SMAP proceeding settlement agreement, which kind of defines how ramps are then brought forward to the commission, then utilities will bring forward and analyze their risk. Everyone gets involved in looking at how that analysis is done and ways to improve it. And then mitigations are put forward that will then address those risks. So to find the best mitigations, prioritize and implement those, and have those show up in the general rate cases for authorization. So if PSPS were looked at as a risk, and it was clear across all parties and utilities that that's what is expected, then utilities will then look at what are the mitigations that they need to do to address that risk, regardless of how it's used as a mitigation for wildfire. So if it requires hardening of a section of line, whether it requires undergrounding, whether it requires sectionalization, that way those programs can be put forward and then addressed, or whether it's a microgrid or other things. So then those can all then be front and center in terms of addressing those risks. In some ways, this is kind of like wildfire mitigation plans. So, you know, wildfire risk is a huge risk. There's an in-depth process now for developing for utilities, and they're required to develop wildfire mitigation plans. So in some ways, this could benefit from a similar process as what's done for WMPs, wildfire mitigation plans. There could be PSPS mitigation plans. And if it were in depth, like it's done for wildfire mitigation plans, we would have a roadmap showing where the utility is today, where it is going to. It would be transparent. Right now, I would say, I don't have that clarity. I don't have that understanding. I haven't seen that from what's been submitted already. I don't understand all of the risks that are impacting the customers that we've touched upon. But if we had that available data, then everyone could then see, okay, this is what we're looking at. This is the utilities plan. It will probably take years to get to the end state, if there is an end state. But that's kind of the same situation we're in for wildfire mitigation plans. We believe we need that for PSPS mitigation plans. So if we had that, it also gives us a context. I mean, we see what's being put forward in the near term, but we understand where it needs to go in the long term. And then similar to wildfire mitigation plans, we need a full understanding of what the risk spend efficiencies are, which is a term that we use in the RDF and the ramps quite a bit, which is showing if you put so many dollars into a certain mitigation program, how does that reduce risk compared to putting dollars into another mitigation program? And so that way you can then have a picture or an understanding of where to put the dollars now to get the benefits now, and then reduce the risk in as expedited a fashion as possible. So PSPS is now, I wonder if there is a PSPS season anymore. I know there was a PSPS event up in Northern California. I think it was in January. And I think there was a PSPS event down in Southern California last month. So it's a huge undertaking, but I think that it's really important that we believe it's really important that we address this in an immediate expedited process. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. Just to kind of give a little more emphasis to the ranking of PSPS as its own risk event. And for those who have been working, we've been working with some of the other parties in this proceeding and with other parties in the individual ramps. But this comes from PG&E's ramp scoring. And if you look on the left, you can see a listing of 12 different safety risks that PG&E identified in its ramp. This data was from its original application. So as the ramp evolved, some of these numbers may have been revised, but this was just to give you the big picture view of wildfire risk. You can see from a safety risk score, it's at the top of the list. And then next below it is third-party safety incident, which is quite a bit less. Well, PG&E didn't use PSPS as a risk event in its one of its top risks in its analysis in its ramp, but they did use it as a wildfire mitigation, and then they used a formula to reduce its effectiveness as a wildfire mitigation because of the increased risk it had to cause other problems. And so, but if we took those numbers for the increased risk of PSPS event and we separated those out from the wildfire mitigation, based upon the numbers that we collected, we came up with a number on this chart to show that PSPS could have been a value of 8,500 compared to wildfire being a risk. I'm sorry, that would be for the risk score on the far right, compared to wildfire risk score being a score of 25,000. So those numbers will adjust, and PG&E will probably say, yeah, but if we did it that way, then those other numbers would change and that kind of stuff. So, but that doesn't, I think, take away from the message that we wish to convey is that if we were to analyze PSPS as a risk in its own right, it would be up there at the very top of the list. I think that would remain the same. So our main, I say, request or recommendation, I think it's necessary, is that PSPS be considered an independent risk, and that way those mitigation programs can then be all brought forward and shown how they will reduce PSPS as a risk. If we go on to the next slide, please. Okay, and then just to highlight a couple of other things about, and this is the last slide, is just, these are the same bullets that were on the front slide. So PSPS event harms are real and the risks are real to the public. I hear about stories, anecdotal stories all the time. You know, there was an event in the East Bay here where because of, you know, the concern about wildfire risk, a large community area, wide area, was de-energized. Well, during that event, there was actually a fire in that same de-energized area. It wasn't caused by, in that case, it wasn't caused, in that one particular case, was not caused by utility lines. However, folks were de-energized. Now they don't have power in the middle of a fire. So fire, as Dr. Mitchell mentioned, as Arthur Fisher mentioned, have many impacts, and we, Cal Advocates, has referenced those in our comments in the ramps and also in this proceeding. We're not going to go into detail on them, but we've also, folks were actually asking questions about is there data? And there is data that we can cite. In fact, we've cited, there's some studies that talk about during outages, looking at, well, respiratory disease hospitalizations, renal disease hospitalizations. You can imagine that folks with these kind of medical conditions are more dependent on power. Elderly folks are more dependent upon power for mobility. I know someone who is in a retirement home who, when the power goes out, loses elevator access in that case, and cannot move or cannot, it causes evacuation problems. It causes a lot of stress for older folks. There's a community near Santa Rosa where during a PSPS event, my understanding is a lot of older folks, even though they may not have had any medical conditions, but they were just concerned and had to be evacuated during a PSPS event so that they could have be more safe. So there's a lot of these impacts. Some of the data that's been brought forward in the SMAP and in the RDF and the RAMP has to do with outage minutes, length and duration, whether they're back to back, whether there's high frequencies of these. That is all really important data that will help characterize the impact of a PSPS event. However, that's not all of the data. That cannot substitute for really understanding, I think, as Mason said from SDG&E, understanding the real health impacts of what that is. And as he mentioned, that we need to look at the real impacts of this. So we can't just rely on some substitute and assume that handles or can serve as a metric for all of the impacts of PS events. We have to understand the real impacts and then determine how can we assess those, how can we then mitigate those risks directly. So that's what we believe needs to be part of this RDF phase 2. And those are some of the health and safety impacts that others have mentioned, we've mentioned in those proceedings. There's also the economic impacts. Dr. Mitchell mentioned some studies too. We've mentioned a study that was done by a Stanford professor after, I believe it was the 2019 outages in Northern California, using some tools from Lawrence Berkeley Labs, which estimated that the cost to the public was $10 billion. So we're not capturing that data, but that's the kind of information that we need to understand. What is a good gauge of the impacts of this so that we can then target the mitigations to expedite this. And now with this drought that we're under, the PSPS events that have already begun this summer and even at the end of last year, we believe, and since we've also seen data to show that PSPS, if we looked at it as a risk, would rank at the near the very top of the list, that we need to expedite this development. So it was really encouraging to hear that the utilities are looking at this, and they're not going to defer their analysis until there's some kind of group consensus. This needs to be done actually yesterday, and to be honest, it should have been done prior to this process that we're going through now. The whole intent of the risk-defined proceeding, this SMAP, was to make risk-based decision-making part of the programs that were already brought out. Some of the PSPS events have shown a lot of gaps in addressing these issues. And so that was the purpose of ramps that we've been doing now for a number of years. And the SMAP proceeding was so that we don't experience these gaps kind of with unaware. This should have been done actually understanding that PSPS events have actually been around, and Dr. Mitchell is very familiar with this because he's been involved in this far longer than I, but down in Southern California, when utilities needed to de-energize circuits. This has been around for many, many years. And so the idea is these mitigations should have been in place a long time ago. So we are strong advocates for doing more now. Don't wait for this process. The utilities right now have more data than interveners do on this. And if they don't, they should have it. And so they need to bring this data forward, and then we can all benefit, we can all vet it out, and we can then expedite this entire process. So, and as I mentioned earlier, is that I do think that there's if we look at WNPs, there is a lot of information that's brought forward there in terms of metrics that are required. We believe metrics are critical to understanding the scope of the problem. Metrics are also critical to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of the mitigations. There's all kinds of possibilities for mitigations that may be brought forward. However, with limited resources and limited time, it's important that the best mitigations be expedited and brought forward now. And that way we can, you know, as we're concerned about the health impacts on folks, we can save injuries, save lives, and save the economic impacts, avoid the economic impacts of PSPS, even though it's everyone, I think, expects that PSPS is going to be a tool that utilities are going to use for a number of years. So, so that's another part of this whole process. Right now, there are some metrics that are being put forward. However, the metrics need to be a lot more in-depth and a lot more clear so that we can understand, in particular, the effectiveness of the mitigation programs that that we need in order to avoid the impacts of PSPS events. So I think I've come to the end of my time. I'm not sure if there's anything else that, well, if there is, maybe I can bring it up if this is now the time for questions. And I think we have another question at the end.
All right, thank you, Chris. I'm going to give us until 11:20 to ask any questions or commentary specific to Chris's presentation here, and then after that we'll just have a general discussion until 11:55.
I have a comment. Yeah, this is Mason from SDG&E again. Chris, I love the passion. I love the way you walked through it, and you were very clear about what you want from this. As you were talking, I was thinking there's kind of like 4 categories of ways that you can reduce PSPS impact. And I just want to kind of go through those real quickly to see like if one of those like, you know, rings a bell with you a little bit more than the others. But so like we could do hardening, which would sort of remove the need to do PSPS at all in that location. And most of the hardening jobs, and we build that into wings where we look at, we say, if we harden here, it's going to reduce the wildfire risk and the PSPS impact. That's mostly kind of like a wildfire combo with PSPS, so it might be a little hard to separate just out the PSPS part. The second one is to like add sectionalizing devices and weather stations so that instead of having to do a whole swath of PSPS, you can kind of focus it on maybe a couple hundred customers rather than a few thousand. So I think that's more of a granular thing that requires a little bit of equipment, but not nearly as expensive as hardening wholesale. Then the third one I thought of was improving our models internally so that maybe we have that really good understanding of maybe we don't even need to do a PSPS over here because we've got this nice modeling now that says, actually, in this case, PSPSing is worse than the wildfire risk. So let's not do PSPS over here because we've got these really good models. And I think that's like the big one that we're trying to conquer here, which is let's really understand the negatives of the PSPS. And then maybe that will sway a little bit of our decision making in real time. And then the fourth one is like just to mitigate the PSPS impact to the customers. So for example, if you know, maybe right now without any education, people are cooking or they are doing a certain behavior. If we can mitigate that through communications or resources, we can lower the impact to the customer. Those are kind of my 4 big groups. Does that kind of resonate a little bit with how you were thinking about it? And maybe we could, you know, I like lists, I guess. We could go through each one at some point and kind of hit where we could find those reductions. Does that resonate at all with you?
Sure, Mason. I think, and if you were to bring, and it sounds like some of those are, and we've talked about this in the RDF for folks who may not be familiar with it, but is cross-cutting mitigations and how to handle those. But I think that sounds kind of like what you're describing. But if those have RSEs associated with them, so that, you know, if you're saying that this is going to cost less and achieve the same result, I think, you know, Cal Advocates is very concerned about ratepayer costs, as ratepayers are very concerned about the exponential rise in rates that we're now seeing brought forward in forecasts. So yes, I think all of those are really good things, as well as any others for the PSPS phase 2 of this. It all sounds useful information.
Okay, I think we're on the same page. Thank you, Chris.
Mason, this is Eric Wojcik. You can just to comment real quickly. I like your categories. I think they're very good, and I like the connection to what's been discussed. I'd just be worried that the categories themselves will limit what we're looking at, and I think we need to look broader. I think that's what Chris really said. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there could be more than those 4. I was just trying to figure out if we were all speaking the same language. I think we are. Thank you, Eric.
All right, any other questions or comments related to this particular presentation? And if not, we can just kind of open it up to a general discussion about things. No need to raise your hand. Just talk when you want to talk. Thank you.
This is Chris Parks. While other people are thinking about something to mention, I'll just add one more little side story. It's real quick, but just to give an example of mitigation for PSPS, and I understand what Mason's saying is that it's, you know, there's all kinds of ways to mitigate PSPS, but as just one example, up in Santa Rosa near Rincon Valley, we learned at a Wildfire Safety Advisory Board meeting where the CCAs gave a presentation, was that there was a section of Santa Rosa called Rincon Valley where it seemed like what they said is that every time there was a PSPS event, this pocket of customers were part of it. And so they looked at it, the local area looked at it to see, well, how can we prevent this from happening? And they found that by hardening just 0.6 miles of line, undergrounding it, then those customers, 20,000 customers, would not need to be de-energized for PSPS events. They were actually, I don't believe it's actually even a high fire threat district, but just because of the way things are configured, they would always have to experience these PSPS events. And I believe there was a video, in fact, on the news like last week with PG&E showing how they were undergrounding a section for this very location. So if this information is brought forward, if there's a plan to show all of these mitigation plans that are necessary, but not just like this one was getting a lot of attention, especially from us, because we saw this Wildfire Safety Advisory Board meeting. But, you know, these kind of mitigations then can be brought forward to understand who are getting it the worst, who are impacted the most, and who are the most vulnerable. So I wanted to throw that story out just so I thought it was of great interest to understand how this mitigation can prevent PSPS events.
Hey, Chris, this is David. You know, I appreciate you mentioning that, and I've heard you mention this, you know, before with this particular group in the Santa Rosa area. I think it's a great example of how, you know, just maybe, you know, how, you know, if just how kind of I will tell these small strategic hardening of the system can have larger benefits there. Do you have any links or reports or anything to where, or some that kind of talks about that? Or you mentioned that it was mentioned during a meeting. Do you have any links or anything that we can go back to and learn more about it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
We actually transcribed for ourselves
Oh,
exactly
great.
what was
Okay.
said, and we also have links to the video. It's this meeting was recorded like many meetings, and so I'll send you that. I'll also send you the news story that came out. I think it was last week, where they were interviewing folks in Rankin Valley. They were saying, well, now our grocery store will not have to get shut down and stuff like that because they were doing this work. So yeah, I'll send you. Absolutely. I'll send that to you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Hi there, this is Katie Morsoni from Turn, and I just want to thank all of the presenters for putting together thoughtful presentations. And I think the thing that I would say coming out of all of this, especially as we look towards scoping this issue moving forward, is the discussion today about how one of the issues of PSPS is that it's never really properly been scored because we're not considering the universe of impacts that can come out of it. We're not really understanding all of the bad things that could be caused by a PSPS, which means that we're not understanding whether this is actually a beneficial mitigation or not. And so I think for purposes of scoring, I think that should be, or for purposes of scoping and moving forward, I think a really key part of the discussion should be creating kind of that laundry list, the exhaustive list of negative impacts, and identifying different ways that we can measure those based both on what the utilities should have, as Chris was saying, there's an information advantage here that the utilities should have, and then, other measures that are out there. So I look forward to working with everyone on this issue because I think one of our concerns is that the failures so far to understand the negative impacts of a PSPS event have potentially led to over-reliance on them as a wildfire mitigation measure. And it's really important to better understand its actual ability to prevent bad things from happening. So thank you all.
Let's see. This is Max Henry from Lumina Decision Systems. I found these presentations extremely interesting. I guess I wanted to understand, well, looking at Dr. Mitchell's presentation, which is presenting a kind of cost-benefit, risk-benefit framework for comparing the costs of the PSPS against potential benefits in terms of mitigating wildfires. Is the scope in these particular proceedings looking exclusively at the costs and risks from the PSPS decision, or are you also looking to compare that against the potential benefits in terms of reducing wildfire risk? Or is that something that's out of scope of this particular proceeding?
Yeah, it's part and parcel of the same thing. PSPS has no real value except as a wildfire reduction mechanism. That's why it's done. And its value has to be balanced against the costs. So both wildfire risk and PSPS risk really have to be looked at the same time, because by trading off one, you are potentially increasing the other. And it is it is at some level a balancing problem.
Sure. I mean, I understand that. I totally agree. Both these things need to be looked at together. But I was just kind of asking about the scope of the work that's being discussed here. Are the utilities being expected to look at both these aspects?
Yes, because as you mitigate or find PSPS risks, it will change the MAVF, the multi-attribute value function approach, and you will be therefore choosing different potentially it could change the mitigations that you choose or you're spending for potential mitigations.
Right.
So
well, that makes sense to me. And I was kind of looking for a comment perhaps from colleagues.
Yeah, so this is Vincent at PG&E. Yeah, in our presentation, we do think that the two are related. And when you look at PSPS consequences, I think it extends to the wildfire risk side as well. We are doing a balancing act, like Dr. Mitchell mentioned, and therefore we need to bring everything onto the scales.
Okay, thanks so much.
And then Max, this is Mason with the SDG&E. I wanted to make sure that the utilities kind of think this balancing act has two different applications. One is a long-term planning, like where should we do system hardening? Where should we add switches to allow for more granularity of activities? And then there's the other in real time. We have a forecasted wind event coming in. When should we pull the trigger? For the most part, those are they use kind of the same, numbers to some extent, but they are different processes. And I just wanted to make it clear about that. I wasn't sure you were clear on that. So I think our focus in this one is to really understand the negative side of the PSPS application, and then in other forums, perhaps compare that to the wildfire risk knowledge that we have, but they are totally inextricably linked. But we want to be able to focus on that, as Katie and I has said at different times today, and Joe, make sure we got a full list of negatives and we're measuring them in some way that's reasonable and well understood. That's the main focus for the utilities, I believe. So thank you, Max, for your question.
Thanks.
I will, you guys are sick of hearing me talk by now, I'm sure, but I will comment on the LBL research a little bit more. And I hope I characterize the joint utility concept, and Vincent or Brian or Chris can chime in if it's different than their experience. LBL and the utilities have had discussions. In fact, I would say for us, for Sempra, LBL reached out to us and they sort of admitted that their I should say current and previous, the current work that's out there is not exactly suitable for PSPS measurement. And maybe Joe mentioned that as well. There are nuances to shutting off power during events. On one side, that it's worse potentially because there's really bad weather coming, and potentially there's a fire coming, and maybe you need to hear information from 911 or the internet or the radio, whatever it happens to be. On the other hand, the utilities are alerting people before the event, sometimes multiple times on the same event, like maybe 1 hour in advance, 3 hours in advance, even the day before. So LBL has admitted that their numbers are not exactly applicable, and they want to do more research to find out what that is. We want that same research done, whether it be through LBL or some other organization. We really want to understand what are those reliability, safety, and financial implications to the customers during PSPS. In our ramp, we've put in, like, it's kind of a starting point, some very general numbers. There's a little bit of customer class breakdown, but it's not nearly as extentful as, like Chris Parks pointed out. Elevators, are we tracking who has elevators? At this point, no. In our ramp, we're not doing that. But we definitely agree with everything that everybody's discussed on this call. It's just a question of the progress that we're making towards it, and coming up with that numbers that we all can agree on. Right now, we have a holding. It's $250 per customer. In the future, it won't be that. It'll be something very different depending on the customer classes and so forth. So sorry for kind of going on, but I know for a fact all utilities understand that this is something, the nut we want to crack, and we're working towards that. And hopefully it's at the pace that's acceptable to all the participants. So I'm done talking. Everybody have a good afternoon.
Well, Mason, this is Eric Wojcik of UCAN, just to say thank you for that. And I think the list does have to be expanded quite a lot, and that's going to be the difficulty. But it's great news to hear that the IOUs, you all want to work with us on that, and I hope we can proceed. Thank you.
So this is Jerome Candelaria at CCTA. May I pose a question?
Jerome, I haven't heard from you in years. Good to hear from you.
Oh yeah, well, it's nice to be back in the groove here. I had a question for Dr. Mitchell in his presentation on PSPS quantifications. He highlighted communications and mentioned the new backup power requirement under the category of mitigation. So Dr. Mitchell, I wanted to clarify, are you suggesting the backup power requirements, when complied with, will mitigate loss of communication as an issue, or are you just flagging it? The reason, well, and the reason I ask is for those of you who followed that proceeding, you've seen communications providers point out that, when whoever's generating electricity is effectively assuming a risk there. And not to mention that residential households will have to have some sort of backup power to make all this work too. So, Dr. Mitchell, I wanted to hear your perspective there.
Well, I think it's a matter of degree at some level. I mean, there's a couple of different effects. One is if your TV's out, your radios are out, your internet provider is not providing internet, then that's going to impact communications regardless of the state of the communication networks. On the other hand, if you've got a charged mobile phone and you want to get information regarding the shutoff or regarding some smoke you see out on the horizon, or you want to report a fire, or you want to make a 911 call, the question is it going to connect to a network that's live or dead? And one of the problems with both landlines and mobile communications has been that they have died after certain amounts of time in various places due to the power on their backup batteries running down. And so the commission has required them, as Jerome indicated, to now provide a certain amount of backup power so that the networks at least stay functional. So I think it's a matter of the degree, a fraction of the risk gets mitigated, not all of it. There is, people will still need to find a place to charge their phones. If they have a landline, that's usually self-powered, but that has to, that won't tell them whether there's a fire coming in, but it helps. And I think we need to, quantify the, how much of an impact is the network and how much of the impact is just having the power itself to power the communication mechanisms. Does that help?
Yeah, no, it does. It clarifies that you're not suggesting that it's a whole scale mitigation for
Right.
communications loss.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
So this is David Van Dyken again. This has been, I think we've gotten some really good information here. I do want to ask or mention, if anybody, has any documentation or links to any, research, reports, analyses that kind of may help us in our scoping and moving forward here, and you're able to share that, please do so. So we have about 10 more minutes for any general discussion. I'll let the folks think about any questions or comments for another minute or so.
Hi, this is Roseanne Ritkevich from the Energy Division.
Hi, yeah, go on.
Hi. So I just wanted to highlight that in terms of the tools from LBL, what I know is that they are actively looking for collaboration from the utilities to match funds with the DOE to upgrade the interruption cost estimate calculator, which is specifically for localized short duration outages, which would reflect more to update the surveys so that the surveys are being taken from areas where the outages have actually occurred, so that the cost of outages reflects people's experience. And they're also looking for collaboration with the power outage economic tool, which is called POET, shortened for POET, which would reflect outage costs at a customer level for widespread long duration outages. So they're working on two different tools, upgrading the interruption cost estimate calculator, and which is for 24 hours or less. The POET tool would be more indicative of costs associated with over 24 hours. PSPSs can be either for short, under 24 or over that, but they're specifically looking for, if the utilities are interested in using these tools, it would be great if they could contact, I believe it's Joe Ito, who would be interested in working with them on, they're looking for collaboration from utilities across the country to upgrade that, and that would actually facilitate and speed the update of that tool. That was one point I wanted to make, and the other point I wanted to ask to think about, and I'm hoping to learn more from this group as we continue these conversations, is what would actually, those tools are useful from a customer survey perspective, but I'm curious as to what metrics would reflect actual experience or actual outages from the cost of the actual outage itself. What kind of metrics are we looking at to make those determinations that might be cross-referencing these estimate calculators. That's all.
Thank you very much for that, Roseanne. Any other questions, thoughts, or comments? Okay, well, not hearing anyone, so I'll go ahead and talk about next steps here and kind of wrap this up. So, again, I want to thank everyone for attending today. We had, it looked like that we had up to 68 participants today, so that's a lot, and I'm very happy that we didn't have any, open mic issues, which is always an issue. Yeah, so as was mentioned before, kind of the purpose of this meeting was to help us to scope how we treat PSPS and the risk-based decision-making framework moving forward into phase 2 of the SMAP proceeding. What we'll do is we'll look through the video and transcript of today's TWG, and that's going to help us to pull out any good bits of information to help put together that scope. Also, we may be reaching out to various participants on their on their own if they have more information to share, so we can have a more kind of focused conversation on certain topics in the scoping. And then we will be in touch with all of the participants here, including everyone on the service lists for the SMAP, the PSPS, and the microgrids proceedings. And again, we'll let everyone know of any, of what our next steps are here. Let's see here. Anything else that any other questions or comments, or Ben, is there anything else that you would like to add here? All right then. Well, hey, everybody have a good day and have a good weekend. And again, we will be in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Very nicely done. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. Much appreciated.
You're welcome.
And thank you to our IT, Brevin Fong, for setting everything up, and Alicia Russell from SPD for helping coordinate the TWG.
Yeah,
Yes.
well said. Yeah, this went flawlessly. Technically, really appreciate it.
Yeah, not like that one technical working group meeting.
Thank you on behalf of PG&E.
Thank you all. Yeah, thank you on behalf of all at SCE. Thank you so much.
Thank you.